Hi, Marit. Thanks for that. And thanks so much to Plug and Play for bringing this really fantastic group of startups and companies together. I think it's really important that we're having this conversation because if you go and ask people about the technologies that we're using to tackle climate change, most likely they're going to start telling you about solar and wind and the other technologies we're using to decarbonize the grid. Or maybe they're going to mention some of the EV technologies being developed at Tesla and elsewhere that are being used to electrify the transportation sector. There's actually, in addition to these super important technologies, there's another critical suite of technologies that we can use to capture, to utilize, and to sequester carbon for the long term. This suite of technologies has got far less attention. In fact, if you go back just 10 years or so, you find an almost complete lack of interest in these technologies from policymakers and investors, even a sense that these are far too expensive, and maybe a kind of feeling that they're a moral hazard and that these technologies are actually some kind of excuse that will allow fossil fuel companies to continue to pump CO2 into the atmosphere. For anyone that's familiar with those technologies, they'll know that that perception was always misguided, and I'm really excited about the change that we're seeing. We are seeing a surge of interest from entrepreneurs, from investors, and from policymakers in these technologies, and I think they're set to make a really big impact. And it's absolutely essential that they do. And so to kind of set the scene a little bit here and explain just why they're so important, I am really excited to have Alex Rosenfeld, who is the managing director and founder of Climate Impact Capital, to tell us a little bit more about these technologies. So over to you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Jim, and I'm very excited to be here with our partners at Plug and Play, who do an incredible job of curating things for corporates and other stakeholders. Just to give a little background on Climate Impact Capital, for those that I haven't worked with, we formed Climate Impact Capital 4 years ago with the mission to address the early stage capital gap, which you're very well familiar with, and it's very much of concern, especially for hardware technologies that take a long time to develop. And we work really almost exclusively with large corporations, both oil and gas and power, around helping them understand the strategies and the types of investments that they can do to manage their scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions around with a focus of climate mitigation, but also transitioning to the new energy economy. So very much aligned with what Plug and Play is doing and bringing technologies and opportunities into the corporate world where there can be so much of an impact. So what we had discussed, Jim, is maybe we thought we'd give our audience a little bit of background, because not everyone is familiar with all the details about why we're looking at this and how this is relevant to industry. So just to start, this is analysis that some may have seen. It's a combination. This information is coming from the IEA, and what we wanted to highlight here is where the emissions are coming from industry. We know we have a lot of industry and corporate partners on the webinar today, and I think for the majority of you, you will kind of see that you fit into one of these areas. So specifically what you see is power generation, industry in general, transport, and buildings make up the bulk of the emissions in one way or other. And these are the CO2 emissions, so it doesn't capture land use. This is more around industry. And what the scenario is that this is the IEA clean technology scenario. So this is looking at a world where policy is already driving a lot of changes, and industries are responding very actively to this. But what you also see is that things don't change quite as much. And what I wanted to really point out here is that this is because, as our participants know, we are locked into a lot of technologies. And this is what this graph is showing, is that power plants have been built, chemical plants have been built, cars have been sold. And this is the lock-in of current technology, and shows how much CO2 we still have to deal with, even as we try to decarbonize. And if we pretty much bring every single molecule going forward and several EVs going forward that are clean tech. So this shows the scale of the challenge. So we can go to the next slide. So many of you will have been familiar with the carbon budget. And what I just wanted to overlay is, the so what to, yes, we're stuck with, in a good or bad way with so many assets on the books. Many of these assets, especially on the oil and gas side, and then also in heavy transport and power, are 40, 50-year-old assets. Well, the so what is, how much carbon do we have left to emit if we're going to have a chance of not going over a threshold? And this is called the carbon budget. So if we are to not go over a 1.5 degree carbon budget, and the axis for that is on the right, we really don't have much time. This is really 10 years left on the budget. And from most notional ways of doing that, it's going to be almost impossible to reach that. And a 2 degree carbon budget, as you see, that extends the time frame for a longer time, but it's still going to be challenging to meet that. So from a point of a carbon budget, if you're concerned as a corporation that there'll be policy around that, this gives you a little bit feeling for the time frame. And if we go to the last slide that I wanted to show for framing, what it also illustrates that if we're looking at a 1.5 degree carbon budget, by 2031, all the rest of the carbon in the system, of the order of 25 gigatons per year, would have to be captured by CCUS or direct air capture or something else, which both shows you the scope of the challenge, but also I think for the purposes of this call and the webinar, the scope of the opportunity, right? This is a great opportunity to bring in new technologies to meet the challenge and to give a kind of a threshold for how big the opportunity is. Right now in the US, there's only about 25 million tons per annum of carbon being captured and utilized. And this number is in gigatons. So there's a 1,000-fold increase of market opportunity to be had just in this next 10 years. So from that aspect, I'm very bullish on the opportunity for CCUS to create value. So hopefully that gives a bit of a framework for the what, who's impacted, what the timeframes are, and what the opportunity is for CCUS.
Thanks, Alex. I think that's really clear, and it really shows the urgency here. This is the IPCC telling us that we simply cannot avoid the really bad impacts of climate change without this technology. So let's move on and think about the technologies itself. So what does it mean? We talk about capturing, utilizing, and storing carbon. What does that mean in practice? How do we do that?
So there's the 3 parts of CCUS. So the carbon capture is where a lot of the technology focus has been for many years. This has been a traditional part of the oil and gas industry where they've been using what are called amine technologies to capture the CO2 and use it for various different processes, often in oil and gas enhanced oil recovery. A lot of traditional technology in place, but a lot of new technologies coming in, such as direct air capture. So there's a lot of mix coming into that. But fundamentally, it's about capturing the CO2. What's important for people to recognize is where you capture it is important because moving CO2 is very expensive. No one really wants to have a new pipeline built in their backyard. It's very hard to permit these things. And then you need to do something with it. And that goes to the 2 other parts, utilization and sequestration. We really like the idea of utilization. There'll be a couple of companies on today's call that do that. So you take the CO2 and you make something useful from it, which gives you the notion that perhaps you can get paid for that. And with that payment, you can offset the cost of capturing it. Sequestration is basically putting it in a saline reservoir, hopefully for 1,000 years or more, or using it for enhanced oil recovery, which is what is done by the oil and gas companies. And here in the US, there's a tax credit called 45Q that gives credits to either oil and gas companies or others who perform that sequestration or use in the OR.
So how do you see the opportunities for corporations? I mean, obviously some of them are clear. You talked about some of the larger industrial processes like the steel industry and the ethanol industry, there's a need there for capture at source. But what about the wider corporate world? What are the opportunities for them to get involved in these technologies?
Well, certainly the capture at source is, if you're going to call anything a low-hanging fruit, that would be it, where there's large source points of carbon coming from petrochemical facilities and from power plants. And that's where a lot of the focus has been, especially from the Department of Energy. We're very interested in circular economy opportunities there of taking that carbon, especially here in the Gulf Coast, and reusing that into chemicals and materials, and basically decarbonizing at least part of the value chain. So I think that's certainly one of the biggest opportunities if you are a major CO2 producer. And I think that's where a lot of the innovation is happening right now. For other industries that are more point source, it becomes more of a challenge. So if you even look at, say, at oil and gas, certainly there are emissions upstream to the process, but the majority of the emissions are at the use, and it's going to be impossible to capture that. And I think that's where we're seeing the story of and challenge on the oil and gas side are, do they move to electric vehicles and decarbonizing through electrification of transport, or do they go and invest into carbon capture technologies for natural gas or even coal? And that's going to be the fundamental part on the electrification of the grid and the electrification of transport.
And you mentioned the circular carbon economy, which I think is something that's getting an increasing amount of attention. It's a really exciting vision. It's this idea that instead of having a linear economy around carbon, we extract oil from the ground and then use it and to do useful things with it. And then it ends up often as CO2 in the atmosphere. We can start to build a circular economy where we might, for example, pull CO2 from the atmosphere and use it to produce, in principle, anything from jet fuel to plastics. This sounds great. It's obviously not the way we're doing things right now. Why is that? What are the barriers between where we are now and an economy like that?
Well, it's challenging. Anytime you're integrating large processes, there's a lot of corporate barriers to changing how you're doing things. Just starting with the simple ones of creating a circular economy, right where you have in petrochemicals and you have large sources. I think in the US and in Asia, that's going to be the first part of the circular economy, especially around plastics, capturing CO2 from something like an ethylene plant or polyethylene. There's a lot of CO2 there, and that carbon can go directly into plastics. And at the same time, we can begin recycling a plastic through those same processes where you take the old plastic, pyrolyze or gasify it and begin putting that in. So not only are you capturing any emissions, but you're creating a circular economy with the goods as well. So I think we're going to see it first in that place. Direct air capture is a little bit of another story. Certainly there's a lot of excitement about it, but the cost of direct air capture right now is 3 to 4 times more than it is to capture the CO2 from a large petrochemical facility. So if you're going to be capturing at near where you're going to use it for petrochemicals or for plastics or for any other goods, you might as well capture it at the place where you're emitting it first. With direct air capture, what we're seeing right now is they're using it in probably the biggest project right now is with Occidental and Carbon Engineering, where they committed to a 1 million ton per annum project to do enhanced oil recovery. And it makes more sense there where they're capturing it from the air and they're not trying to ship it across the country to the use there. But there's a long way to go on that technology, but it provides a lot of potential benefits if we think about the future of advanced manufacturing, where if you can capture CO2 efficiently anywhere, here's the big and, you can have an efficient way of using renewable energy to create other products anywhere, then you become creating a new type of economy. But I think that's still a bit further away.
Great, thanks, Alex. So we're moving towards towards hearing from the startups. We've had a couple of questions from the audience. I just want to put to you before we hear from the startups. So Paul Ebert has a great question on what he calls the social license concerns. I think this is the sort of moral hazard issue that I refer to. And Paul says the court of public opinion is a tough one, and CCS has a tough road to convince. He can't see us meeting the decarbonization challenge without it, but we can't underestimate the social challenge. And I think that's really true. And I'm kind of waiting for a backlash towards these technologies, which I haven't seen yet. But I could totally see it coming. What do we need to do to convince the wider world of policymakers and the general public that these technologies are important and should be deployed at scale?
Well, I think part of it is to convince the public that they're not going to be paying for this, or at least the public that is going to be most impacted. So this is not regressive. So, one way that that's happening right now is, of course, is that basically subsidies from the federal governments in terms of tax credits, and those tax credits basically come from could be coming from corporates that are paying taxes and from more of a progressive tax base versus if the oil and gas companies or the petrochemical companies or the steel companies were having to put that on everyone. So just kind of as a feel for how much that could impact things and why this is so important is I just did some back of the envelope calculations, and using, let's say, the cost of direct air capture, if that was applied to oil and gas as an offset for people's vehicles, that could increase the price of gasoline at the pump by as much as 50-60%. If we were applying a carbon capture technology to a natural gas plant for an average consumer, that could increase their price by 15 to 25%, and on an industry level as well. So this is the big fear, not just in the US and others, is that the people who are going to be paying for this are the people who have the least ability to do that. So same as what we're having in the COVID-19 impact. So I think that the road to halt is that the oil and gas companies, the petrochemicals, the utilities, as well as the government needs to invest in technologies that allow these costs to fall significantly enough that the corporations can absorb the cost without passing it on to the public. And the only way you can do that is by creating these integrated R&D plans, investing into the future right now, and not waiting, 10 years, for the other shoe to fall when there's a $50-$60 carbon tax.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Let's just, one final question before we go to the startups. Let's just go back to direct air capture and the costs, because it's such a nascent technology that there are very few data points on the cost curve for the technology. But what we do see on that cost curve, I see personally as ground for optimism. We've gone from a situation where it was several thousands of dollars per ton down to, and this is based on projections, but relating to the Oxy project that you talked about, certainly less than 200 and maybe less than $100 per ton. Still a lot. It's a great deal more expenses than other forms of offsets. But this is a cost curve. And as we get more data points, we'd hope it would come down even further. Where do when you think about the companies and the investment and the technologies involved, where do you think we can get to in, say, the next 10 or 20 years?
Well, so using traditional carbon capture techniques, CO2 capture techniques, you can see it, in the $40 range, but that's for technologies that are getting very concentrated CO2 in the 50 to 80% range. So just with those mechanics there, it's going to be, I think, in the 50 range, 50 to 60 range if things get good. But I think what's kind of missing, and just wanted to add to that, is even if we got direct air capture and everything down to $20-$30, it still begs the question of who's going to pay that. So we need to create technologies that take that CO2 and make that into edible protein that's selling for $5,000 a ton, into cement products, into steel, into plastics. All of these commodities are selling for $500 to $2,000 a ton. And then it doesn't matter if you're creating a product that's over $200 a ton. It doesn't matter if you're paying $50 a ton or $100 a ton for the capture. So that's why we're very bullish about finding ways to use it, because if we find great ways to great materials, we can do direct air capture anywhere, because we have a product that we can make that has a value of 5, 10, 20 times more than what it costs to capture the CO2.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Alex. So Alex and I are going to hang around at the end for another 15 minutes or so if there's anyone interested in firing questions at us and continuing this conversation. But for now, we have a fantastic group of startups assembled, so let's hear from them.